Hi, so today we're going to talk about the mid-19th century in France, so the mid-1800s in France, and the road leading up to the Second Republic. So we've talked, in the last module, we kind of talked about the last kings of France, the last monarchs descending from the Bourbon family. So in here we're going to talk about what leads up to the Second Empire. So we can talk a little bit about life in France in the mid-1800s. Unfortunately, in France around 1840, France was faced with bad harvests, which obviously results in a decreased supply of food, which turns into higher prices as a consequence. And when people have to pay more for the same amount of food that they used to get, they are not happy about it. So there's a growing discontent in France about the situation. And if you recall, the last monarch that we studied, named Louis Philippe, he was known first as the citizen king, but then he turned into the bourgeoisie monarchy, and the bourgeoisie was something that favored the upper middle class of France. So although at first he appeared to be a man of the people, he later on turned into someone who kind of favored people with more resources. So we have Louis Philippe and we have the bourgeoisie monarchy. Disappointment for the people, and price of food is rising. One of the ways that the French kind of dealt with this is that they actually lowered their birth rate. So in a lot of countries at the time, the birth rate was still increasing, but in France, they were actually practicing birth control. Fewer people were dying from diseases, and so people were living longer. They needed fewer people for labor on the land, so they started practicing birth control. The other reason for this is that with the advent of the Napoleonic Code, or the Civil Code, which we talked about in the last module, one of the key features of the Napoleonic Code is that the inheritance goes to the heirs equally. So the fewer children you have, the less your wealth is dispersed. So the fewer children, if you only have one child, that child receives everything. If you have two children, two heirs, then they each received half. So it benefited families to have fewer children at the time so that they could keep the wealth in one place, and one child or two children could properly benefit from this instead of having 8 children left with very little each. So these were two reasons for practicing birth control at the time. And one thing that was different about France also at this time is that in other countries, people were moving towards the cities. So let's take England, for example. England is already starting the Industrial Revolution. France has not yet started the Industrial Revolution. It's about to start, or it's getting there. It's moving towards it. But England is already experiencing the Industrial Revolution. So France still has more people living in the countryside than they do in the cities, which also means that most likely the people living in the countryside are healthier to begin with, since they're not living around a bunch of people. So it's not as congested, they don't have the heavy concentrations of people that can be found elsewhere. And so the towns and cities in France are surrounded by land. They're still fairly healthy places, and they have fairly easy access to land, agriculture, nature, fresh produce, that type of thing. Also, another thing that is going on, in the mid-1830s, a law was passed, the Guizot Law, which meant that there should be one school in each commune. So a commune is what you would call a town or It could even possibly be a village, but regardless, where there's a concentration of people, there had to be a school. And France is moving towards this idea of really educating the masses. Um, so once you start educating the masses, of course, literacy rates go up. Literacy rates go up. People start reading newspapers. They start reading newspapers. They're exposed to different ideas, and they become educated and are able to see things from different perspectives, which is going to come into play a little further down the road. So French people are developing the ability to really think for themselves by being able to read a variety of print. So there are some cities in France where the Industrial Revolution is a little bit further along, and the people there are not necessarily happy with it. There's a growing discontent with the bourgeois monarchy favoring the upper class. And from this, you have authors such as Victor Hugo, who wrote Les Miserables, and Stendhal emerge as voices for the oppressed, and their ideas are far to the left. So you start seeing in the mid 1800s, you start seeing a shift towards the left, towards more liberal thinking, a kind of an annoyance with capitalism, an annoyance with the bourgeoisie and the upper class. They want more populism. So France is getting ready at this point for complete refusal of governance by a king, and they're almost to the start of the Second Republic. And so here we have some pictures, and this is just to illustrate the difference between, let's say, a French city that is nearing the Industrial Revolution, which you see on the left. So it's still, fairly large streets, not completely congested, obviously tall buildings for the time. But you have, if you look on the right, the top right, there's an illustration, and this is London in the 1800s. And it's just rows and rows of houses, and just pollution and nowhere to really breathe and kind of get away from it. It's just very congested, very polluted, and you can imagine what that would be like. People using their bathrooms, and people doing their laundry, and putting out their trash. We're not at a time yet where there's a real system for collecting sewage and collecting trash. And so what happens when you have this situation, when you have so many people living in one small area with no real means of disposal of waste and extreme pollution? Well, you have illness that settles in, and the illness of the time is cholera, and it affected France as well. Thousands of people died from cholera in France, as in England. In France, it was about 143,000 people died in 1853, 1854. So this is a massive number of people. Other things that were going on at the time leading up to the Industrial Revolution, or a big effect or a big cause of the Industrial Revolution, is, of course, the development of the railway system. So here you have some illustrations of the evolution of the railway system. So in the topmost part, you see horses drawing carriages, and it looks like the carriages are actually on rails, but you still have horses drawing them. So it looks like you have the first class cabins, which are more spacious, and then you have the second class cabins where people are sitting on the roofs of the cabins. In the second part there, you have horses drawing goods from one place to the other. And then in the last one, you have the locomotive drawing what looks like massive amounts of coal. So this is the product that really made the Industrial Revolution possible, was coal. Coal powered the locomotives, and it also heated homes and powered factories. So we're in an era, we start being in an era where it's important to have coal, and coal represents mobility and progress. So we have the development of the railway, which was a big deal in France. So, like I said, the big thing that happened with the development of the railway is the increased exchange of goods. And in France, the emphasis was especially on luxury goods. So France was known for its luxury goods that it exported and kind of sold around the country. Also, farmers were able to now collect their goods and sell them throughout the country. So winemakers were able to sell their wine. Other goods were able to be shipped, maybe some salted meats, stuff like that. And this meant that the farmers no longer had to be self-reliant. They could now expand their business opportunities. And it was a time of growth for people who were able to sell their goods. And like I said, the use of coal obviously powered the whole machine, and also powered other things such as heating machines and things like that. So at this time, if you remember from a previous module, France was functioning under the three states, where you had the clergy, the nobility, and the people. And the three states, the idea is no longer really there, since we no longer have the nobility, really. What France is dealing with now is class warfare. So we have, the bourgeoisie versus the peasants and the common people. So some of the philosophers and the writers and the artists of the time, they make note of that, and they publicize that, and they call on the people to rebel against this type of idea, and they inform the people of the injustices that are going on as far as class warfare goes. So this becomes the new fight. The fight is no longer between the three states, since the clergy has largely been taken out. The nobility is almost gone. We're left with the people, but the people have been divided into separate classes. So one thing that happens around this time is that they grant universal male suffrage. So all men can vote, not only landowners, just all men. So the voting population at the time goes from 250,000 to 9 million people, which is a massive shift. So one man who saw what was happening and was able to parlay it to his favor was the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. So Napoleon had a nephew, and his nephew was Louis Napoleon. I think there was also one of his cousins was named Napoleon Louis. I'm sure they were all had some variation of the word Louis and Napoleon in their names. But anyway, so this is Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew, and this is Louis Napoleon, and he's going to be known as Napoleon III. So I'll just refer to him as Napoleon III from now on. So after the defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo, the French decided that they no longer wanted to have this person who was able to become emperor and then also have his position inherited by heirs. So they exiled anybody related to Napoleon. So Napoleon III, or the future Napoleon III, is not living in France at the time, but he feels that he should be entitled to be the next ruler of France. So he sees an opportunity here. And in 1848, tensions rise, and Louis Philippe, under pressure, abdicates. And a group of journalists and authors and thinkers of the time kind of take the reins of the government on a temporary basis. And this is the start of the Second Republic of France. So they don't intend really to name themselves president or anything, but they disagree with the ideas of Louis Philippe. They had a rebellion. Louis Philippe, under pressure, said, okay, I get it. And he leaves France. He's exiled, never to come back. Him and his family leave France. And in the meantime, Napoleon III sees an opportunity to garner the attention of these people and get their votes. Now, I'm not really sure what his initial intentions were, but he he spoke as a man of the people, someone who wanted to see justice done and this type of thing, a more fair system, things that would appeal to these 9 million voters. And in 1851, he organizes a coup d'etat. He takes over the government. He seizes power and declares himself president for life. Now, at this point in time, if you became president, you had a limited term. But, things are turbulent, and he takes the reins of power, and he decides that he's president for life. A year later, he declares himself emperor. So once he declares himself emperor, that's when he officially becomes Napoleon III. So in the next module, we're going to talk some more about Napoleon III and the events that lead up to the Third Republic, and also World War I. So that will probably be several modules. But definitely in the next module, we're going to talk a little bit about Napoleon III. He was an interesting character. And I will talk to you then. Thank you. Goodbye.